Hey folks, Michael here, Life Along the Way. Good to have you back. We've been talking, we skipped a couple of weeks, though if you're just catching up with us on YouTube, you might not actually realize that. But it's been a while, so quickly in review, what we've been talking about as we've been going through this confirmation class is the goodness of creation. We've been talking about how God created the whole world and that it was good and it was very good. And we talked about how he reveals himself, that God reveals himself through his creation. And not only does he reveal himself through his creation, but we experience him through his creation. And that all of creation is a communication. God's revealing of himself happens partly in creation. And we experience God. Like the only way that we can live as human beings is as created people, as part of the creation. And so anything that we experience of God is part of the created order. We've also talked about our dominion over the whole creation, and that we, as man and woman, as human beings, that we have been given dominion over all things, and the plants, the animals, the trees, everything we've been given in that is related to what we talked about is our priesthood. You know, as we are the people, as humans, we speak God's word to the creation, and we speak on behalf of the creation to God. We say it is good. We name things. We give meaning. We are created to be the priests of this creation. We also talked about sin. We talked about how sin is brokenness and the destruction, the brokenness between the relationship of God and man, God and the creation, man and the creation, man and himself, and man and his neighbor, man and one another, man and woman in the case of the story in Genesis 3. And so then we also talked about how sin was choosing the creation for itself, for its own pleasure, for what it offered to us directly, if anything, rather than receiving all of the creation in gratitude as part of our relationship with God. How all of the creation was given to us as the context to live out our spiritual life, if you will, our relationship with God, our sacred life. All things were given to us as part of relationship with God. And but then we chose the one thing that could be chosen for relationship with itself. And now we're going to transition on this video. We're going to begin to transition to why have we been talking about all this stuff? Yeah, it's good. Maybe it's nice theology or whatever. Why have we been talking about it? Where are we leading with this as we're talking about Anglican confirmation and what we believe here as Orthodox, Anglican Orthodox Catholic believers? That's where we're going to go today. All right, let's do it. All right, so we've been through the creation and the fall in Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And of course, we're not going to go through the rest of Genesis step by step like that. But time passes. Cain and Abel are the next story, right? And Cain kills Abel. A question that we might ask ourselves, and it's always an interesting thing to ask, is if what Christ is doing is simply to rectify the fall, in that he could have just come as Abel, and wop bop a loo bop, we would have not needed to have however many years of all the Old Testament story to get us to where Christ came. But that's not what we're talking about today. We go through Cain and Abel, we go through the Tower of Babel, we go into Noah and the flood, what seems to be a complete loss of the worship of the true God after Noah. It seems to be a complete loss of the worship of true God. In fact, when Joshua is talking and recounting the story of calling Abram out of Ur of the Chaldees, he mentions that the law, there was no worship of the true God. And God chooses Abraham and brings him along. And, why does God choose Abraham? Just because he's Jesus' great whatever grandfather? Yeah, perhaps. We see in his choosing of Abraham that he is a God of blessing, that he makes particular promises to Abram. He says, I'm going to make you a nation and a people, people for my own possession. I'm going to bless you so that your name will be great, and so that you, your people, your descendants, will be a blessing to others. I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing to others. That begins to sound like what was supposed to be happening in paradise in the garden in Genesis 1 and 2. And he says, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And he says, to your offspring, I will give this land. That's all part of his promises to Abraham. We could go down that line, but I think we're trying to stick to distinctives in this set of videos. Then we have the story of Jacob comes along, which is also an important story, where Jacob spends all night wrestling with God, and God changes his name to Israel. And I've always found a lot of comfort in the fact that of all the names that God chooses for his people, he chooses to call them struggles with God. That is the name that he gives his people, struggles with God. And you only struggle about things that you take seriously. But it is interesting that he does call his people struggles with God. And so we have down the road when we get to Jesus, we're going to recognize that he's the offspring of Eve, the one who was going to crush the serpent's head, that he is going to exist to be a blessing to the world because he's the offspring of Abraham. And we also recognize that maybe our relationship with God might be a struggle, and that Jesus is working in that space as well, and is the fulfillment of all that. All that is just to give color to where we're going next in this conversation. But there is one more Old Testament story. There's a lot of more Old Testament stories that we should tell, but one more that prepare us for the next step in this conversation that we're having. And that is the story of the Passover, because we're going to be moving in our next video about discussing the Eucharist, and we'll be discussing that for quite a bit of time, and our whole ceremony of the Eucharist and the liturgy and what we do and why we do things. And all the things that we've been discussing we're going to come up again when we get there, but the Eucharist is related to Passover meal, like that is what Jesus would have been celebrating. There may be some discussion on exactly the particularities of that, but the Eucharist is the fulfillment. Christ is our Passover, right? And but just to talk about for a moment that story, and I recommend if you're interested after this discussion, go back and read. It's in Exodus 12. Is a good, you kind of read at the beginning and at the end to hear it. But what happens is, this is right after all the plagues on Egypt, and God is going to kill the firstborn of every household, but he tells them to kill a lamb and to smear the blood on the doorpost. And he gives very particular instructions about what they are supposed to do in the Passover, in the actual event of the Passover. But more importantly for our conversation, he also tells them that they are supposed to do this every year. He's very detailed on how they are to remember the Passover in future generations. He gives them very detailed instructions on what they are to do. He tells them that they are to, on the 10th day of the first month, they're to take a lamb without blemish and set it aside. On the 14th day of the month, they are to kill the lamb at evening. And they do particular things with its blood, and then they surround their entrances with it. And then he gives them details on how to cook it and what they are to eat with it, how they are to be dressed, how the whole meal is to be prepared. There's many details. And then he says, eat it and recall that it is a sign that God has delivered you from slavery and preserved your life. And so a question that might come up for us, should come up for us, is Why did God have them do all these actions? Each year as they commemorated this event, this essential event in their life, why did he have them do all these actions? Couldn't they have just simply read the story and all nodded and then gone on home? But he doesn't. He gives them detailed actions that they are to do every year to remember this thing. And not only that, he gives them detailed actions as we go from the Passover out into the wilderness. And God gives details about how to build the tabernacle in the wilderness. And he gives very detailed instructions on how the Levitical priesthood is to conduct their ceremonies. And he can be very specific about what he wants in his worship. And so a question we might ask, is it reasonable if the Jewish culture was used to ceremony, is it reasonable to think that the Jews that became Christians would have just thrown out ceremony entirely? They might have, but they might not have. And maybe we can talk about that as well. And is it reasonable to think that if God was so particular about ceremony at one point, that ceremony has no meaning now? Not to say that he's been particular about the exact ways we have to worship him now. He's said in spirit and in truth. But perhaps ceremony in itself is important, and God was trying to convey that as we read it in the Old Testament. And I think that is one of the things that we recognize, that the importance of ceremony in human life and the human existence. Because we see it anthropologically. We see it in every culture, that every culture creates ceremony around that which it holds important. And they do things in particular ways and dress in particular ways to show more importance to particular events or particular things that their culture values. And we do that as well. We swear in our presidents and governors and whatnot in particular ways. We at football games, we put our hand on our heart when we say the national anthem, sing the national anthem. We put our hand on our heart when we say the pledge. We expect soldiers to behave in particular ways at those events. And in fact, we're going to watch a clip right now about an event that really demonstrates the importance of ceremony that I want to talk about, and that's the military funeral with honors. And we're going to watch a video. It's a dramatization. It's from a movie, so it's not a real life, but it does give us a lot of talking points. But as we go into the video, I want to remind you that the only important thing, the only thing needed, is that they would get the body from the car and put it into the ground. Let's watch the video.
Your father was a good man. Growing up without him is going to be hard. It's going to hurt. You'll feel alone, out to sea with no shore in sight. You'll wonder, why me? Why him? Remember, you have warrior's blood in your veins. The code that made your father who he was is the same code that'll make you a man he would admire, respect. Put your pain in a box. Lock it down. Like those people in the paintings your father liked. We are men made up of boxes, chambers of loss and triumph, of hurt and hope and love. No one is stronger or more dangerous than a man who can harness his emotions, his past. Use it as fuel, as ammunition, as ink to write the most important letter of your life.
On behalf of the President of the United States and a grateful nation, I present you this flag in recognition of your husband's heroic achievements. You have my deepest condolences.
So what to me is a moving clip from the scene from this movie. But it is dramatized, right? There is background music, there's the narration, and depending on what you think about what he's actually saying, you may like it or dislike it, may add, but that doesn't matter. What's important to think about is the only thing that needed to happen was to get the body into the ground. And there's all sorts of ways that could have happened, and there's all sorts of respectful ways that could have happened. The men could have come dressed up in matching suit and ties, like at a wedding. They could have all come in tuxedos, like in some weddings, which is another example of ceremony. But they didn't. They came in their uniform, and they pull out the casket, and they're carrying it down towards the grave, and you see something that looks just like our church service. You know how when the cross comes in, we bow. You see as the casket passes, the sailors, they salute. They come and they salute as it passes, and then they hold that salute. And then they pass by. The sailors are standing. The family is seated. These are all actions that are conveying something, and we recognize it internally, and that's what we're kind of talking about. And as they move in, they're dressed in their uniforms. We don't see the other parts of the ceremony, but then before they put the coffin into the ground, they fire the guns into the air, right? And we might say, oh, that's just empty ritual. Like, what's the point? But we recognize it as having meaning, that it's conveying something, even if we can't explain what exactly is conveyed. And then they take the flag off the coffin, and and we don't see this part, but they fold the flag in a particular way, and it's one person at each end and one person in the middle with their hands underneath the flag. And they don't need that person in the middle. These are two professional guys. They're not going to drop that little flag, but the action conveys a meaning about the symbol that is the flag. And then at that point, they just need to get the flag to the widow. And they could have just handed it to her and then said some nice words from the podium, but that's not what happens. They do the ceremony differently. They have an officer who takes the flag with his hands, one on the above and one below, and he takes it and he kneels and he gives it, and then he gives the prepared speech on behalf of the President of the U.S., etc. And he gives it to her, and then expresses his condolences. And it's a prepared speech. It's not just him speaking from the heart. Maybe he says that at the end. But it is prepared, and we see all these things, and we don't think of them when we watch them in that sort of way. We don't think of them as empty ritual, although because we understand implicitly meaning in them. We might not even be able to explain it. If we tried to explain the meaning, it might become less. But we do experience the meaning by the ceremony being done in a particular way. It conveys, by doing it in a particular way, the ceremony conveys more than simply our intellect can understand. We understand it deeply, implicitly, the meaning of all these events. And so as we move on to our next conversation next time, we're going to talk about the Eucharist and how all these things that we've been talking about over these past few weeks, how they all tie together in this essential ceremony, this essential ritual, this essential event of Christianity. So thanks for joining me. God bless you on the journey. We'll see you down the road.